The Self-Sufficiency of Happiness in the Nicomachean Ethics. St. Thomas's commentary is an aid to a contemporary interpretive dilemma. A slightly different version of this talk was given at the University of St. Thomas Center for Thomistic Studies Colloquium Series. W.F.R. Hardie's 1965 article, The Final Good in Aristotle's Ethics, launched a debate about how much Aristotle meant to include in happiness, or eudaimonia, in the Nicomachean Ethics. Hardie argues that some parts of the work, especially in Book 1, suggest that happiness will turn out to be a collection of a number of goods, no one of which is the end of the others. An inclusive end, he called it. But ultimately, in Book 10, Aristotle restricts perfect happiness to contemplation alone. His explicit view, Hardie says, as opposed to his occasional insight, makes the supreme end not inclusive but dominant, the object of one prime desire, philosophy. End quote. Since the publication of Hardie's article, a number of articles and books have been written attempting to reconcile the apparently contradictory texts in the Nicomachean Ethics and to explain the work's true doctrine of happiness. Is it contemplation alone, so that every other good is desired for the sake of contemplation? This is called variously the dominant view, intellectualism, and monism. Or does the Nicomachean Ethics teach that happiness, the ultimate end, is a collection of goods? This is called the inclusive view. Or is the true doctrine of the Nicomachean Ethics some middle way between the dominant and inclusive views? In this talk, I will discuss some of the apparently contradictory texts in the Nicomachean Ethics and some problems with the dominant view. I will then discuss one text in particular, the Book 1 passage on the self-sufficiency of happiness, and attempt to correct a misinterpretation of this text in light of St. Thomas Aquinas' commentary. I will then, in the second half, discuss what I take to be St. Thomas's view of Aristotelian or connatural happiness, whether it is inclusive or dominant. So first, what texts in the Nicomachean Ethics elicit this interpretive question? In Book 1, Aristotle concludes that happiness is activity of soul in accordance with virtue or excellence. In Book 10, the last book of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says that happiness is activity in accordance with the highest virtue, which is, quote, the virtue of the best thing in us, end quote, the intellect, and that this activity is contemplation. He makes 8 arguments for the superiority of contemplation above activity of other virtues, one of which is that contemplation, quote, alone would seem to be loved for its own sake, end quote. Activity of moral virtue is relegated to a secondary kind of happiness, and Aristotle seems to identify perfect happiness with contemplation alone, especially when he says in 10.8, happiness extends then just so far as contemplation does, and those to whom contemplation more fully belongs are more truly happy, not as a mere concomitant, but in virtue of the contemplation, for this is in itself precious. Happiness, therefore, must be some form of contemplation. This conclusion in Book 10 comes as a surprise to some who read in Book 1 that happiness is activity of virtue, and if there is more than one virtue, then activity of the best and most complete virtue, complete sometimes being understood, incorrectly I think, to suggest that happiness will include all virtues. Then we read that virtue is desirable for its own sake, and then we read about all the moral virtues, which takes most of the work, books 3 through 7, and then we read 2 books, 8 and 9, about the importance of friendship, including that, quote, without friends, no one would choose to live. Then suddenly in Book 10, friendship and moral virtue appear to be excluded from perfect happiness, and happiness seems to turn out to be nothing but contemplation, and it's not obvious why moral virtue is necessary for happiness at all. Which brings us to the problems for the dominant view. It seems possible, if the ultimate end is nothing but contemplation, that we should refrain from doing acts of virtue when they hinder contemplation. Pass by a drowning child on the way to the departmental seminar, to take David Charles' example. If contemplation is really the one end for the sake of which we should do everything else that we do. Further, as David Cade explains, quote, according to strict intellectualism, it would be right for one person to steal from or to defraud another in order to obtain the wealth required to have the leisure for theoretical activity. for on this view the end justifies the means." End quote. To avoid these problems on a dominant understanding of happiness, it would seem necessary to say that moral virtue is somehow necessary for contemplation as a means. But Aristotle does not say much about this. Even if moral virtue is necessary for contemplation, the dominant interpretation would seem to reduce activity of moral virtue to a mere means to contemplation, rather than as something desirable in itself, as Aristotle claims that it is on several occasions in the Nicomachean Ethics. These problems have motivated an inclusive interpretation of the Nicomachean Ethics. One of the first and most influential articles arguing for such an interpretation is J.L. Ackrell's Aristotle on Eudaimonia, which argues that happiness is a collection of intrinsic goods, including contemplation and activity of moral virtue, desired independently of each other, for their own sake. Activity of moral virtue is for the sake of happiness by helping to constitute it, being part of it, not by producing it as something different from itself. Ackrell marshals several passages in Book 1 to defend this interpretation. I will focus on just one of them, which brings us to the third part, the self-sufficiency passage in Book 1, Chapter 7. Book 1, Chapter 7 is the very important chapter where Aristotle concludes that happiness is activity of soul in accordance with virtue, on the basis that happiness should be final, self-sufficient, and should be the activity of our function, or characteristic activity. I will focus on the passage about the self-sufficiency of happiness. The passage, as translated by W.D. Ross, is on your handout, broken into 3 parts. If you read Nicomachean Ethics out of Modern Library Classics, Basic Works of Aristotle, that's W.D. Ross. I'm going to attempt to correct 3 aspects of his translation and Ackrell's interpretation that results from it. The whole passage reads as follows. The self-sufficient we now define as that which, when isolated, makes life desirable and lacking in nothing. And such we think happiness to be. And further, we think it most desirable of all things, without being counted as one good thing among others. If it were so counted, it would clearly be made more desirable by the addition of even the least of goods. For that which is added becomes an excess of goods, and of goods the greater is always more desirable. Happiness, then, is something final and self-sufficient, and is the end of action. Now Ackrell paraphrases the passage in the following way. We regard it as the most worthwhile of all things, not being counted as one good thing among others. For then, if it were simply the most worthwhile of a number of candidates, the addition of any of the other things would make it better, more worthwhile, and it would not have been lacking in nothing. According to Ackrell's understanding of self-sufficiency, then, 1, happiness must lack nothing, and 2, nothing can be added to happiness, because happiness already includes it. And on Ross's translation, a third point is that if something were added to happiness, there would be an excess of goods, too many goods. This understanding of happiness has been called not just inclusive, but comprehensive, or utterly comprehensive, because it makes happiness include all possible goods. Although most translations suggest this interpretation, which Ackrell takes as part of his inclusive interpretation of Book 1, it has been criticized by some. Michael V. Wedden, for example, writes the following blistering criticism. It has no textual basis, but only doctrinal motivation. Beyond this, the passage makes a parody of the doctrine. Although Ackrell characterizes the final good as inclusive of all intrinsic goods, not these, but the least of goods are supposed added. Since any such addition would enhance eudaimonia, we must then suppose the final good to contain all such hypothetical additions. Otherwise, following Ackrell, it would lack in something. Following Wedden, I think the most obvious reason for rejecting Ackrell's utterly comprehensive interpretation is that it is absurd that a lack of small goods cause someone not to be happy. Eustratius raises the example of beautiful hair, and Stephen Clark gives the example of chocolate creams. These goods should not be sine qua nons of happiness. It also contradicts other parts of the Nicomachean Ethics, that a lack of small goods would make a virtuous person unhappy. Another reason to reject Acryl's interpretation is that it proposes an unattainable goal, having all possible goods. But Aristotle states in Book 1, Chapter 6 that, quote, "we are now seeking something attainable," end quote, as Robert Heidemann points out. Fortunately, we do not have to interpret the self-sufficiency passage in this way, and St. Thomas Aquinas interprets it much differently. His understanding of the passage differs from that of Ross and Acryl in three important ways, which brings us to the next part of the talk, St. Thomas's interpretation of the self-sufficiency passage. As I mentioned, your handout has Ross's translation of the self-sufficiency passage divided into three sections, each of which contains a difference in interpretation or translation between Acryl and Ross on the one hand and St. Thomas on the other. The first difference is that between lacking and needing. 1. Lacking versus needing. What Ross translates as lacking in nothing, meidenos and dea in bold in your handout, could be translated also as needing nothing. According to Little Scott Jones' Greek-English lexicon, endeis can mean wanting or lacking, but it can also mean in need of. And Stephen White argues that the term, quote, signifies an absolutely basic need. He says that Aristotle, quote, uses the same term to characterize our need for such vital necessities as food and drink in Book 3, Chapter 11, and Book 10, Chapter 3. Grosseteste, a medieval translator of Aristotle into Latin, translates meidenos and dea as nullo indigentem, and indiges, like the Greek indeia, can mean wanting or needing. St. Thomas, who uses the same word in his commentary on the passage, means needing, for reasons that should become clear further on. St. Thomas comments upon this part of the passage. This is in your handout, marked SLE, for Sententia Libri Ethicorum, saying that Aristotle says that the self-sufficient is that which, even when had by itself, makes life desirable and needing no exterior thing. Nullo exteriori indigentem. St. Thomas continues, happiness does this eminently, otherwise it would not terminate the inclination of desire if something that man needed remained outside it. Certainly everyone in need desires to have what he needs. Hence it is clear that happiness is a self-sufficient good. Understanding what Ross translates as lacking in nothing instead as needing nothing greatly reduces what must be included in happiness in order for it to be self-sufficient. It does not have to include all goods. This restriction becomes even clearer in the next paragraph of St. Thomas's commentary, where he says that something can be self-sufficient in two ways. In one way, it can be self-sufficient such that it is, quote, incapable of receiving an increase of goodness from another, a condition of the being that is totally good, God, end quote. Because any good added to God would have its goodness from God in the first place. The second way that something can be self-sufficient is, quote, that it has everything necessary for a man. This quote is the next one in your handout. In this sense, happiness, the subject of our present discussion, has self-sufficiency because of itself it furnishes everything that is necessary for a man, but it does not supply everything that can come to a man, end quote. So St. Thomas understands Aristotle's meidenos and dea as needing nothing that is necessary, rather than lacking nothing. And he says that only God can have self-sufficiency in such a way that nothing could be added to his goodness. In other words, he does not read the self-sufficiency passage in a way that makes human happiness utterly comprehensive, like Acryl does. The second way in which St. Thomas's interpretation differs from that of Ross and Acryl is that he understands the passage to be indicative rather than counterfactual. As Anthony Kenny points out, the Greek is ambiguous on this point, but may be more naturally translated indicatively. On Ross's translation, the text is arguing that goods cannot be added to happiness, because then the absurdity would result that even the least of goods would improve it. Read this way, it is a reductio ad absurdum. However, the use of the subjunctive English were, would be, is not necessitated by the Greek, where Ross translates, if it were so counted, it is clear that it would be more choice-worthy. The Greek does not include the verb to be at all. This is common in Greek and Latin. It only gives a passive participle, sunarithmoumenein, or counted together. Literally, the bolded Greek text reads, in your handout, the second point, but, counted together, clear that more choice-worthy. It is left to the English translator to supply the appropriate form of to be, whether it is the indicative is or the subjunctive were, would be, since the Greek does not specify. Anthony Kenny translates the text in a less clunky way than I just did, but still more literally than Ross, maintaining the ambiguity between the two possible ways of reading it. He translates, "We think happiness most choice-worthy of all things, without being counted along with other things, but if so counted, clearly made more choice-worthy by the addition of even the least of goods." St. Thomas understands the text indicatively. He says, continuing the quote we have already seen, that, quote, "Happiness has self-sufficiency because of itself it furnishes everything that is necessary to a man. But it does not supply everything that can come to a man. Man can be made better by an additional good." End quote. And the context seems clear that the happy man can be made better by an additional good. So this result is possible for St. Thomas. It's not an absurd result that negates the protasis. It's not a reductio ad absurdum. Just a little further on, St. Thomas comments, as shown in your handout, that, quote, "Happiness, therefore, has this quality above everything else. It is desirable even when not augmented by other goods. However, if it does receive an addition, be it ever so small, surely that is even more desirable." From this quote, he continues with an explanation why, and this brings us to the third difference between St. Thomas's understanding and that of Ross and Ackrell, which is that of excess versus superabundance. St. Thomas says, as shown in your handout, that, quote, "The reason is that by the accession, a superabundance or an increase of good is effected, and because something is a greater good, it is more desirable." Where Ross translates excess for huperoke, St. Thomas says superabundantia. Huperoke can be translated as excess, but also it can be translated as superiority. And I concede that St. Thomas's superabundantia can also be translated excess, but the context of both the Nicomachean Ethics passage and his commentary show that superabundance is the sense of the word, rather than excess, because Aristotle continues on to say that, quote, "Of goods the greater is more desirable," which does not suggest an excess, as though happiness had been made worse by gaining too much. Adding goods to happiness is not causing an excess, rather it is making happiness better. Taken all together, these three changes yield something like the following as a translation of the whole self-sufficiency passage. This is also found in your handout. The self-sufficient we now define as that which, when isolated, makes life desirable and in need of nothing, and such we think happiness to be. And further, we think it most desirable of all things, not counted with other things. But, counted with other things, it is clear that it is more desirable by even the least of goods, for that which is added becomes a superabundance of goods, and of goods the greater is always more desirable. This shows that we are not forced to take Ross's translation or Ackrell's interpretation of the self-sufficiency passage. This is true not only of the passage in isolation, as it turns out, but also as a means of escaping the dominant interpretation and its problems. It already seems that St. Thomas is taking some inclusive interpretation of Aristotelian happiness from his commentary on the passage we have just examined, since he says that goods can be added to happiness. This would not be possible if happiness necessarily consists of one thing only, as the dominant interpretation would have it. This brings us to the second half of the talk. Does St. Thomas consider Aristotelian or connatural happiness to be inclusive, dominant, or some middle way? There are other indications in the commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics that St. Thomas considers Aristotelian or natural happiness to be in some sense inclusive. For one, he says that some external goods are needed for happiness and not as instruments for activity of virtue. He comments on 1.8, quote, "There are some external goods which lend a beauty to happiness, insofar as they make a man pleasing in the eyes of others, giving him a kind of splendor." At this point, he, Aristotle, adds that a lack of certain externals clouds a man's happiness, making him, as it were, contemptible in the eyes of others, as is evident in a man who lacks noble birth, good children, or even physical beauty. A man is not entirely happy when he is ugly, since this makes him contemptible and despised. The same is true of one who is low-born, or who does not have good children." End quote. Noble birth, good children, and physical beauty somehow contribute to happiness in a way other than by being instruments for contemplation. We see St. Thomas making this distinction when he says, "Certain goods in which chance plays a part do conduce to happiness, but happiness does not chiefly consist in them. Some, though, are necessary for a certain decoration of happiness, and others work instrumentally to attain it. But we must not attribute happiness to chance because of these secondary goods." These secondary goods are desired not as instruments, then, to contemplation, or even to activity of moral virtue, and happiness does not chiefly consist of them. This suggests that happiness does consist of them for St. Thomas to some degree. Another indication in the commentary is St. Thomas has some inclusive interpretation of the Nicomachean Ethics, is that in places where he says that happiness is contemplation, he often qualifies by saying that happiness principaliter, principally, or maxime, especially, consists of contemplation. Even when commenting on the earlier quoted passage from Book 10 that seems so strongly to identify happiness with contemplation, that is, happiness extends then just so far as contemplation does, and those to whom contemplation more fully belongs are more truly happy, not as a mere concomitant, but in virtue of the contemplation. End quote. Even on this passage, St. Thomas comments, "It follows then that happiness consists principally in some form of contemplation." From these considerations, it seems that St. Thomas considers Aristotelian happiness to be in some sense inclusive. The unnuanced inclusive view has its own problems, though. I will briefly explain two. One problem is that if happiness consists of more than one item desired independently of each other, then there is no way to know how much of one to pursue and how much of the other. As Acrel complains, Aristotle fails to, quote, tackle the question, how should they be combined in the best possible human life? What really is, in full, the recipe? End quote. And if contemplation is divine, as Aristotle says, and activity of moral virtue human, then it would seem that there could be no good reason to sacrifice even a small amount of contemplation for activity of moral virtue, as Acrel concedes. He says, "The suspicion remains that a man who really believed in the supreme importance of some absolute could not continue to live in much the same way as others." End quote. It seems we should devote ourselves entirely to contemplation. So even Acrel, the premier defender of an inclusive interpretation of the Nicomachean Ethics, says that it doesn't work philosophically. A second problem with inclusivism is that, as Stephen Jensen points out, it would be impossible to choose which good to pursue at any given time, because there is no further end with respect to which to deliberate. All parts of happiness are equally final on this interpretation. There are multiple ultimate ends. And choice is deliberative desire, according to Aristotle, the conclusion of a deliberation among means to a given end. There's no deliberating about ends, As Aristotle says, a doctor does not deliberate about whether he will heal, but rather about how he will heal. Which treatment best achieves the end of health? So there can be no choosing between components of happiness, since they're all equally final. There can be no deliberation, and therefore there can be no choice, which is deliberative desire. There is no further end with respect to which to deliberate and choose. St. Thomas, fortunately, does not take such a strongly inclusive interpretation of Aristotelian happiness. He takes a middle way between an extremely inclusive and an extremely dominant interpretation. According to St. Thomas, moral virtue is desirable in itself as well as for the sake of contemplation, and contemplation forms the essence or the most final part of the contemplative life, while moral virtue forms the essence or most final part of the active life, or secondary happiness. Activity of moral virtue, then, is included in happiness, or can be, and it has contemplation as a further end. Contemplation is the one most final component of happiness, bringing unity to the whole of happiness. In this last part of the talk, I will explain these features of St. Thomas's middle way position on what is included in happiness. And the first feature was that moral virtue is desirable for its own sake and for the sake of something further. St. Thomas affirms with Aristotle that moral virtue is desirable for its own sake. It's not just a means for something further, such as contemplation, even contemplation. When Aristotle explains that the ultimate end is most final, he says that, quote, not all ends are final ends, and that, quote, that which is never desirable for the sake of something else is more final than the things that are desirable both in themselves and for the sake of that other thing. And therefore we call final without qualification that which is always desirable in itself and never for the sake of something else. End quote. So for Aristotle, it is possible for something to be loved for its own sake as well as for the sake of something further. It is a final good, but not most final. As examples, he lists honor, pleasure, reason, and every virtue, because we choose them for themselves, but also for the sake of happiness, whatever happiness turns out to be. Commenting upon this passage, St. Thomas says that there is a gradation of ends. Quote, there we find an object desired not on account of some formal goodness existing in itself, but only as useful for something else, like bitter medicine. We find also an object is indeed desirable on account of what it is, but besides, it is desired for something else, like sweet-tasting medicine. This is better than the first. But the most perfect good is that which is so desired for its own sake that it is never desired for the sake of anything else. Here then, the philosopher, that's Aristotle, distinguishes 3 degrees of good. St. Thomas repeats Aristotle's list of goods desirable for themselves and for the sake of happiness when he further comments, we do choose honor, pleasure, knowledge, and virtue for themselves. We would choose them or have a desire for them, even if no other good would come to us through them. In fact, we choose them for happiness, precisely because we think we will be happy in having them. St. Thomas, then, does not consider moral virtue as a mere means to contemplation. But we also see from this that although virtue is desirable for its own sake, it is also desirable for the sake of contemplation. How, then, does moral virtue promote contemplation? This is a question we do not have much of an answer for from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We do have a little. He does say in Book 6 that, quote, the work of man is achieved only in accordance with practical wisdom, or prudence, as well as with moral virtue. For virtue makes us aim at the right mark, and practical wisdom makes us take the right means. He also says, the end is not evident except to the good man. End quote. So moral virtue gives us the correct end of contemplation and makes us love it as an ultimate end. It also makes us satisfied with contemplation. St. Thomas notes this in his commentary on the self-sufficiency passage discussed earlier. This is the last quote in the handout. It's in the last quote in the handout. He says that although happiness, quote, does not supply everything that can come to a man, and that, quote, man can be made better by an additional good, a man's desire for this does not remain unsatisfied, because a desire controlled by reason, such as a truly happy man should have, is undisturbed by the things that are unnecessary, even though attainable. End quote. Without moral virtue, then, desire is not controlled by reason, and what happiness ought objectively to consist of is not subjectively satisfying. In order to experience happiness as self-sufficient, in order that desire be quieted by the true good, we must have moral virtue. Similarly, in the first part of the second part of Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas explains that rectitude of will, or moral virtue, is required for happiness, quote, because rectitude of the will consists in being duly ordered to the last end. And, quote, just as matter cannot receive a form unless it be duly disposed thereto, so nothing gains an end, except it be duly ordained thereto. And therefore none can obtain happiness without rectitude of the will. End quote. So we have some explanation why moral virtue is necessary for happiness, generally understood, but why might moral virtue be necessary for contemplation in particular? Aristotle says precious little to serve as an answer to this question. This contributes to the difficulties raised at the beginning of this paper for a conception of happiness that consists of contemplation alone. It seems the contemplative does not need moral virtue, or should even perform morally bad actions if it were to promote his contemplation. St. Thomas, however, does explain why moral virtue is necessary for contemplation in particular. He says that activity of moral virtue belongs to the contemplative life dispositively. That is, it disposes a person for contemplation. The way in which it does this is by producing the necessary peace. In his treatment of the active and contemplative lives in the second part of the Summa, he says, for the act of contemplation, wherein the contemplative life essentially consists, is hindered both by the impetuosity of the passions, which withdraw the soul's intention from intelligible to sensible things, and by outward disturbances. Now the moral virtues curb the impetuosity of the passions, and quell the disturbance of outward occupations. Hence moral virtues belong dispositively to the contemplative life. End quote. Elsewhere he explains, in particular, temperance and fortitude curb the passions, and justice quell outward disturbances with other people. In Summa Contra Gentiles, St. Thomas also says, all other human operations seem to be ordered to this one, that is, contemplation, as to an end. For there is needed for the perfection of contemplation a soundness of body, to which all the products of art that are necessary for life are directed. Also required are freedom from the disturbances of the passions. This is achieved through the moral virtues, and prudence, and freedom from external disorders, to which the whole program of government and civil life is directed. And so, if they are rightly considered, all human functions may be seen to subserve the contemplation of truth. End quote. To see how moral virtue promotes contemplation, we can also look at the ways in which vices hinder it. There are many cases in the Summa Theologiae in which St. Thomas explains the evil of a vice in terms of its harmful effect upon the intellect. A daughter of gluttony is, quote, dullness of mind as regards understanding. Gluttony is sinful because it impedes the use of reason, and this goes even more for drunkenness. And, quote, venereal pleasures, above all, destroy the mind of man, end quote, because they make the lower appetite, quote, vehemently intent on its object, end quote. Hence a daughter of lust is blindness of mind. Furthermore, any delight in physical things whatsoever would seem to hinder contemplation, since, as St. Thomas explains, any extraneous delight distracts from an activity. That is, delight in one thing distracts us from another thing. Therefore, in order to be perfectly happy, in order to engage in contemplation, it will be necessary for the body to turn away from all these things, which is only possible through moral virtue. Moral virtue then disposes to contemplation. For the contemplative, moral virtue is directed to contemplation as its end, and belongs to the contemplative life not essentially, but dispositively. Essentially, the contemplative life consists of contemplation alone. Essentially. St. Thomas says that the contemplative life, quote, is busied with one thing, that is, the contemplation of truth, end quote. And that the contemplative, quote, orders the very cessation by sleeping or occupying himself otherwise to the aforesaid occupation, that is, contemplation, end quote. The active life, on the other hand, has activity of moral virtue for its essence. Activity of moral virtue is for the sake of external operation in the active life, and for the sake of contemplation in the contemplative life. So how do the various parts of happiness fit together? For St. Thomas, multiple goods belong to happiness, but in different ways. If we look at Aristotle's short list of goods desirable for their own sake and also for the sake of happiness, honor, pleasure, reason, and virtue, St. Thomas fits them into happiness in different ways. Honor results from happiness. Pleasure is a proper accident of happiness, flowing from its essence, just like risible flows from rational animal. Reason is the power whose activity is the essence of perfect happiness, and moral virtue, as we just saw, disposes for contemplative happiness and forms the essence of active happiness. What about the goods of fortune we looked at earlier? Noble birth, good children, and physical beauty. In the commentary, St. Thomas said that these goods belong to happiness, not as instruments, but by lending a certain beauty to happiness, though happiness does not chiefly consist in them. It seems that if they are not for the sake of happiness, as means, and they are not what happiness chiefly consists of, then they must be some kind of accidents of happiness. In the first part of the second part of the Summa, St. Thomas distinguishes two ways that something can belong to a thing's perfection: by constituting its essence, and by pertaining to its well-being. As examples of something pertaining to man's perfection by pertaining to its well-being, St. Thomas gives beauty of body and swiftness of ability. They are not necessary for happiness to exist, but they make it better. They are accidents of happiness. Connatural or Aristotelian happiness for St. Thomas includes multiple goods, which either form the essence of happiness, result from the essence, or are its accidents, pertaining to its well-being. Distinguishing the essence and accidents of happiness also helps to correct the utterly comprehensive misinterpretation of the self-sufficiency passage. I will finish with this quote from Stephen Clark, who was among the first to correct Ackrell's interpretation of the self-sufficiency passage. He says, Orthodox commentators, that is, those who take Ackrell's interpretation, Orthodox commentators have entirely failed to understand the nature of the whole-part relationship. Wholes are not mutilated by the privation of just any part, Metaphysics 5. And the eudaimon, or the happy man's life, is not mutilated by being deprived of chocolate creams, any more than his body by being clean-shaven. His claims to eudaimonia may be shaken by the loss of friends and other such goods, as his life may be threatened by the loss of limbs. But there are certain essential organs which are the essence of his life, and likewise certain essential activities well performed. Thank you.